Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. Hope everyone's well. I think this is class number 8, if I'm not mistaken, maybe more, in our Torah and Moshe ongoing series, Letters of Rav Soloveitchik. We want to welcome back Dr. Shapiro, who was a couple of weeks in Israel. We'll have this week and next week. And if you want to hear Marc in 2 Monday nights, I urge you, although I don't know if we can get you in still, to our Portugal trip, but you can let us know. We'll try to get you into the Portugal trip. And if that doesn't work, Tunisia is in the middle of July, and then the August 1st, our trip to Greece. Those 3 trips will be run by Dr. Marc. And if you like him on Monday nights, this is just a foretaste, an hour. What's an hour? Wait till you hear him talk for 5 hours straight on the bus. And that's the fun part and the interaction. And I'll let so please, everybody is welcome. And there really are wonderful trips. You understand Jewish history in a way that you can't understand from reading history books. That I'll say for sure. Okay, I think I said enough. And
yes, well, I actually think it's class 13.
You know, 13 could be. I don't know, why did I say 7?
We did 18 on Lieberman. So I think we should at least do 18 on the Rav.
No, at least 19. At least this week's part of the Kavachomer to Ayolavo, meaning only 18. Okay.
And because we're going to be starting now with Rabbi Helfgott. Oh, let me turn this off here. Rabbi Helfgott's collection. So that could be like a little bit of a break. I want to finish up with all the things, maybe even take 20 minutes that were on my in my shelf in the back that I'll get to, because someone asked me about Rav Kook and soccer. Now, Rav Kook was defamed by many people for various things, be it the claim that he said that the Hebrew University, Kim B'Tzion Teitzei Sora, about the Hebrew University, when he never said that, or all sorts of things were made up about Rav Kook, either intentionally or unintentionally. Depends who was doing it. And one of them was that he praised soccer players, and he thought that was such an important thing. It's not true. What that's a distortion of is when in Orot, the famous chapter 34, where he speaks about people who engage in exercise, working out sort of thing. And he speaks about how important that is and how valuable that is. And he even says that it's higher than reciting of Tehillim, not learning, but just simply reciting. And this is, of course, related to Rav Kook's notion that when we return to the land of Israel, we no longer can just be a spiritual person. We also have to have physical strength. We need it to defend ourselves, to build roads, all these things. As part of Rav Kook's the great dialectic, that you have the spirituality and the physicality, and now we're going to create a new Eretz Yisrael Jew that encompasses both of them, but it's really not a new Eretz Yisrael Jew. This is the way Jews used to live. But for almost 2,000 years in the Galut, we forgot that. In fact, Rav Kook says also in Orot, we forgot that our body is also holy. So he's attacked soccer incorrectly, but he did speak about soccer, and he spoke about it a number of times. So, for instance, if you look in his responsa, Orach Mishpat, that's on Orach Chaim in his Miluim number 152, he has a whole letter here to the newspaper Doar Hayom, in which he responds to a certain individual who argued that it's okay to play soccer on Shabbos. And he goes through all the problems, especially Rishus HaRabim, they're going to be carrying, and people are going to come, they're going to violate Shabbos when they get there. He continues with this. In fact, the Maccabi soccer team played on Shabbos, and in 1931, after a number of years of not having done so, and he has a letter in which he says, "Hineni mocha bazeh," that I publicly protest, how they're doing this, how they're disgracing the Shabbos, and he has a few other examples of this. However, and now let me say, however, he does have a letter in which he acknowledges that for those people who are not Talmidei Chachamim and who know enough to know that technically, if let's say you're on a flat surface, there's nothing wrong with playing a ball on Shabbos. He says that his exact language is You could find it in a number of places. It's in the periodical Priya Aretz. Rav Suriel has it in Otzrot Hariyah. I think it's in volume 2, page 1060, if I'm not mistaken. I made a note here. What he says is that these Tzi'irim who are on Shabbos afternoon, they're being mevatel from Torah, and we can't bring them back. He says that I don't see how I can say if they're not violating, technically, if they're not violating Shabbos, I don't see how I could say that it's Isur Muchat. And therefore, he says, I'm not going to protest about it. For these people who are not going to be learning or anything like that, I'm not going to make a gezer. I'm not going to protest. And these are Stam people. So what's the difference between this and the other? Well, the difference is obvious. When you have a bunch of people in the backyard Shabbos afternoon want to kick a ball around, obviously Rav Kook would feel happier if they're sitting and learning or something like that. But we're dealing with the Hamonam here. That's what they do Shabbos afternoon. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's, however, when you have an event, a sporting event, an actual Maccabi games, and people are coming, by definition, they're being Machal Shabbos, how they get there. So, Rav Kook distinguishes between, I think, something which it's obvious to all of us, although, I think it's obvious to all of us. When you have a little game in your backyard, you play a little basketball, Shabbos afternoon to relax a little. The rabbis might not like it, but at the end of the day, we all know that it's not forbidden. And that's very different if you have an actual event of, let's say, you belong to a sports club and they're having a game. And even if you walk the half a mile and you have a real, you go to a real, it's your basketball semifinals or something, and obviously, when it's a Jewish team and all the Chil Shabbos that's required to put on a game like that, and people are coming to it. So that's the difference. So I think we can say that Rav Kook is very nuanced. And he speaks to the time, and we can appreciate his insight in saying that there's two levels here. There's the Hamonam, and then there's the people who we can say that should be doing better things Shabbos afternoon. Okay, I thank Yehuda. We spoke about the so-called letter to Meir Kahane, and I have a little more to say about Meir Kahane in a minute. But Yehuda suggested that we can take the letter, it's in the archives now, Israel State Archives, and we can get DNA from the letter. So I wrote back to him and I said, what do you mean? But how is that going to tell us who wrote it? And he said, no, we don't need to know that. We can see if it has Rav Soloveitchik's DNA on it. That is the letter that the letter that was sent, if it has Rav Soloveitchik's DNA, not that we're going to see who actually wrote it, but that'll at least determine it. And he sent me something that for about 2,500, you can test DNA from old letters or postage stamps. So if anyone has access to that and you want to do it, gesundheit. By the way, and I thank Rav Mordechai for pointing out in that letter, supposedly from Rav Soloveitchik, he says to Chaim Herzog that you're descended from the Divrei Malkiel. And for some reason, I just took that as a given, but I also forgot that Rav Herzog's father was from Lemja, but the Divrei Malkiel Tzvi Tenenbaum, he's the Rav of Lemja, but he's no relation to Rav Herzog. Where did the letter writer get this? Perhaps Shaul Lieberman is a nephew from the Divrei Malkiel. So perhaps the forger could confuse Shaul Lieberman with Rav Herzog. I'm not sure. I want to say a few more things about cooking on Shabbos, because I had a lot of correspondence and I found some interesting things. First of all, I just did a Google search and I found that Rav Lebhar, I have all the Sfarim in Hebrew. For those of you from Los Angeles, he used to be in Toronto, I believe. He was a Rosh Kollel, or in Montreal. He's in Los Angeles, a big Talmud Chacham, has published a number of volumes of, he's published his own Shuvot. He's also published Halacha, 4 volumes, I think, of Magen Avot on the Moroccan halachic tradition. And I had forgotten, he discusses this, that already going back to the time of the Tashbates, they write about how the Moroccan practice, the practice in Fez, was to reheat soup on Shabbos. Again, the Shulchan Aruch says you can't. There's bishul achar bishul. But the opinion of the Rambam and the Ran and others is that there's no bishul achar bishul with liquids. And he writes that he says that the contemporary Moroccan poskim say only b'diavad. So for instance, quote, if one were to place previously cooked soup back in the oven, then one would be able to eat the heated soup. But he says that you shouldn't rely on this l'chadchila, because that's not the custom today. And even Moroccan poskim say you should only do it b'diavad. But we saw the Rav, and we saw the Rav's mother. They held like this shita that there is no bishul achar bishul by liquids. We also saw that in Maimonides, the rules for Maimonides, they specifically say, and he says in those rules, not to reheat liquids. But I think the reason for that, as I mentioned, is because with liquids, you can't get to Yad Selenisbo. And you can't rely on people, the Hamonam, you can't rely on them if they're making food, caterers, to be careful about this. So that's because we know in the Rav's own house, we saw the testimony from Mrs. Tversky that they did reheat liquids. So I think you have to assume that there's a difference with caterers because they're not going to be careful and they're going to heat it up. And that's a problem. I also looked again. I was trying to go through some of the Shiurei HaRav Soloveitchik put up by Rav Shechter on Shabbos. And he says something here. Often the Rav would say things in Shir, putting it out there. It doesn't mean it's halacha. He's putting forth ideas. And I think this might be an example here on page 216, because he's speaking about reheating on Shabbos. And he says, it appears to me that when you have a blech, you should also cover the buttons with a tape. Now, I don't know, maybe the Rav held it, but I haven't heard the Rav held that, and some do. But why I mention this now is because he talks about an oven. And he says that if you're heating food up in the oven, we spoke about that, he says you would also need hatzrich tape. And that would mean tape on the every Erev Shabbos. You'd have to put tape on the buttons that you raise the temperature. Now, I've never heard that before, and the people who told me the Rav Shita never mentioned this, the NCSY never did this. So I'm thinking that this is not halacha l'maisa, but he's saying that, you should, this is the sort of thing you should do. You should have tape on it. I think if you asked him, do you have to? He might say, well, it's a good idea, but, the olam, the minhag's not to do it. So when I see things like this, often you see in the shirim, he might say things, but he personally didn't do it. I think he's raising it as an issue that, maybe this should be done, but that's not the minhag, or that's not what the earlier sources would imply. Whatever it is, if any of you have other different information, but I never heard of any. In fact, I haven't heard of anyone with tape on an oven because generally they assume you don't put it back in the oven. And I want to raise one final thing about cooking, introduce you to something which maybe, I don't know if anyone knows, because it's not exactly a very popular book, but it's called Shelos Aaron from Rav Aaron Felder. Who is Rav Aaron Felder? Rav Aaron Felder is this, I guess he's probably born in Toronto. Well, he must be born in Toronto. The son of Rav Gedalia Felder. Let me show you something here. I've shown this in the past, but for the new people, there he is. Rav Aaron Felder with yours truly 10 years ago. So you see I've aged. I was a scholar in residence at his shul in Philadelphia. I could tell you it was a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. What an interest! What a raconteur. He sat next to me. We sat together, and in Motzei Shabbos, the whole Shabbos, I felt bad for the Rebbetzin because the whole time he only spoke to me. We were sitting next to, but he knew so many stories of Gedolim. Look, he grew up in a house of one of the Gedolim, and he was a Talmud Muvhak of Moshe Feinstein. Very few people went to Tiferes MTJ. Actually have one I was listening to just right now, it did, but most people went to Lakewood, Mir, and all that. He went there and he didn't leave. He stayed there, became very close to Rav Moshe. He published Hanhagos of Rav Moshe, Rishumei Aaron, and he became a real excellent Talmud Chacham. He was the posek of the Chaf K, and he died, unfortunately, about a year after that visit that I was there with him. And he was, I'll just give you an example. He wasn't one of the Gedolim, but look, I saw something with him I hadn't seen anywhere else. He was basically blind at that time. He could see shapes and everything, but he couldn't read. This in 2013. I don't know if you call that legally blind or whatever. People would read him things. In fact, they read him my blog posts because the only time it ever happened is Shabbos drasha. When I was there, he insisted on giving a drasha, which is unusual because usually when I'm there, they don't have a drasha, so they finish at 11 and I speak. He wanted to give a drasha because he wanted to respond to something I wrote in one of my blog posts relating to Rav Moshe. And so it was very interesting. And he was friends with all the Gedolim. I saw him, we had a shiur, he gave a shiur before Shacharis. I think it was 8 o'clock, 8 to 9. And he has a Gemara in front of him, but he really couldn't read the Gemara. But he opened it up. And as someone is reading the Gemara, or reading Rashi, I can't remember, he corrects him on the words. He was doing this from memory. So that was quite interesting. Okay, so why do I mention this? Because he has 2 volumes of Shelas Aaron. He has others for him, but these are quite interesting. His responsa. How many pulpit rabbis write Shelos and Shuvos? It's not so common today. But if you look in volume 1, he has 2 volumes. Number 21, he has a letter here to Rav Moshe Heinemann. Rav Moshe Heinemann, great Talmud Chacham, the posek of the Star K. Now, what he quotes from Rav Heinemann, I wouldn't have known about it if not for this. The fact is that Rav Heinemann has a number of interesting shitot. The Star K is regarded 100% as one of the top hashkachas in America. I guess you have the OU, the OK, the Chaf K, and the Star K. And yet, I have to tell you, and I hope I don't offend anyone from Baltimore saying it. It's not me saying it, but there's the other hashkachas I know for a fact have a big problem with a number of the shitas of the Star K. And there's been a number of issues with the Star K. The most famous one, perhaps, is the so-called Shabbos, it should be Yom Tov, but Shabbos, what do they call it? Shabbos ovens or Shabbos compliant ovens, whatever they call them, which means that the oven won't go off on Shabbos. But Rav Heinemann Shita is that if the oven is on, you can, on Yom Tov, you can raise the temperature. I don't know why you need to raise the temperature of the oven. Right? Just if you want it at 350, just put it at 350, but whatever. He holds that you can raise the temperature of the oven. But you have to, and when it's on this Shabbos, they call it the Shabbos, Yom Tov mode, whatever, you don't see the lights. So you don't see, you put in the numbers, let's say 350, and raise 350, so you have to just take it on faith that it's going up to 350 because you don't see the numbers. From my own standpoint, I like to see someone actually explain why on Yom Tov there's a problem having the numbers change on an oven. Actually, what the Isser is, that because that I don't understand. You can actually use fire, so I'm not sure about that. But in any event, and Rav Heinemann, he has a shita about bishalako, about that if you leave the not the pilot light, the light in the oven. I mean, the temperature of the light in the oven is nothing. What does that give? It gives almost nothing, but it gives some heat. He holds that that's enough to remove the problem of bishalakum. And he's had other shitas as well. And when years ago, when there's a chayrim from the Agudas Rabbanim that this goes back to the early part of the 20th century, that a slaughterhouse that slaughters treif can't also have kosher. You can't have both. And the Star K started doing that. They had a slaughterhouse, giving a slaughterhouse that did kosher and non-kosher. Now, they claim that they really weren't in violation of the Agudas Rabbanim thing, but there's no question they were. And I remember in my town, because I guess the VOD goes by the OU, whatever, they removed this meat under the Star K and they put it together with the Hebrew National. That is, we have an aisle, which is like the kosher aisle, all the super kosher, Hamish foods, everything, all the, so they put it with the Triangle K meat. I actually called the Star K at the time because I'm it's not for me to talk about halacha, but I know about the history. And I explained to the guy that the other hashkachas were saying were absolutely correct, that they were in violation of this. But I also told them that not everyone held to this chayrim. There were two organizations in the early 20th century. There was an organization called also Dego HaRabbanim, and that had, Knesset HaRabbanim. There was another one, Dego HaRabbanim. Knesset HaRabbanim had Gedolei Yisrael also, Rav Yehuda Levitz, Rav Gavriel Zev Margolios, who was certainly one of the greatest Talmidei Chachamim in America in the early 20th century, and they did not hold to this chayrim. They said as long as you have it set up properly, you could have a plant that has a kosher side and a non-kosher side. And so I told the guy from the start, hey, why don't you just say that? But in my mind, there was no question that they were in violation, and they backed down after all the pressure. So why do I mention this? Because you have a letter here about something that I find fascinating, that he says, it's known that you, Rabbi Heinemann, hitir lamar lenachri b'Shabbos lahachzir davar gush mavushal asher hutzonen ala eish mamash. That based on this, it's Rav Heinemann Shita that that a non-Jew on Shabbos can take dry food and put it back on the fire, put it in an oven, do all these things. And it's a shus to shus, that's mutter b'kol mitzvah, because of Suda Shabbos, you need hot food. And he writes to him, I'd say to you that I find this shocking. Temaheni ma'od al haheter hanal caterer Yehudi. That is, that you have a Jewish caterer that will tell the non-Jew to put it in an oven and everything. So he says this is not the correct, this is not Ramosha's approach, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, at the end, he concludes, B'shum ofen ein lahatir. You can't permit this, that it's asur l'nachri hachzer davar gush tzonen mevushal aish b'yom Shabbos. So that's a very interesting, I don't know if that's still the Star Case Shita or if Heinemann Shita, but it's an interesting Shita. I hadn't, until I read the Sefer, I didn't know about this. The only thing I knew is that there have been heterim given to old age homes, Jewish old age homes, to have, the old people, that they need hot food. To have, and it's too complicated, I guess. It's a lot of people to set it up with blechs and all that. So there have been heterim given by Rabbanim. I know for one, Rav Dayan Toledano from London. He has in his Sefer that I think Rav Apfel from Leeds was the one who suggested this. But it's a Dayan Toledano that in a situation, because they have the status of a chol she'ein bo sakana, or maybe the chol she'esh bo sakana if they're very old, that there you can heat it up for them, put it in an oven. But to stam have a caterer do that, so I see why Rabbi Felder was upset, but it's an interesting shita. So those who were writing to me about different approaches on Shabbos, if anyone can write to me, does anyone in Baltimore hold of this? I don't know. Incidentally, following this letter, there's 3 letters that Rabbi Felder writes to Rav Shechter, in which he disagrees with him. He thinks Rav Shechter is too machmir on certain kashrus things. Okay, let's leave that aside. And now we're going to pick up, but before we pick up, actually, I want to revisit the letter to Meir Kahane for 2 reasons. First, and maybe some of you who remember the period can help me out on this. Oh, the first thing I want to show you before I even get to this is that I forgot to mention something last class. Let me pull this up. Oops, oh no, wrong thing. Sorry. I want to get to here. Yes. I discovered in the Israel State Archives. In fact, I was in Israel last week. The whole time I spent just in various archives. As always, I found really interesting things. Not so much from the Rav. I found 1 or 2 things from the Rav, but not so important. But this is a letter I found. The earliest record we have of Rabbi Meir Kahane. It's in writing. I think this was 1954, I believe, or 56. I'm not sure. One of the two. He's writing a letter to the chief rabbinate, and he wants to know In fact, hold on, I wrote it down. I got this from my blog post. Hold on, I'll tell you where the letter was. 54. So he wants to know about, according to the Torah, what do we do in the state of Israel? Can non-Jews be members of, can be government officials in the parliament, these sorts of things? And he wonders if we can rely on the Meiri, who says that most matters that the Gemara says about non-Jews don't apply today. So you see that already in his youth, Rabbi Meir Kahane was thinking about these things, and it's a very intelligent letter and not extreme at all. But he wants to know, if you want to have a Torah state, what do you do about non-Jews having authority over Jews in a Jewish government? But what I can need some help perhaps is as follows. We spoke about Meir Kahane's first shul. And here is, and Rabbi Kelman was absolutely correct in his memory. Here's Rakefet's memoir from Washington to George Washington Street. He says as follows. He speaks about his relationship with Meir Kahane, how Meir Kahane was head of the Bnei Akiva that Rakefet was in. And then he says as follows. In 1958, Rabbi Meir became the spiritual leader of the Howard Beach Jewish Center. Located in Queens, this congregation was more traditional than fully Orthodox. The synagogue's most flagrant violation was that it lacked the partition, mechitza, that was required for the separate seating of men and women at religious services. And then Rakefet says that such arrangements were widespread during that era. But he says that Meir's success in this position was to be his undoing. He says that many of the young people were enchanted by him, and they began to observe Shabbos and Kashrus. Dissatisfaction with the rabbi reached a boiling point when Meir attempted to install a mechitza in the synagogue sanctuary. A general meeting was convened during March 1960, at which a large majority of the members voted to dismiss the rabbi. And then Rakefet says, I always felt that this ordeal influenced his personality and future endeavors. He can never again be a team player and couldn't interact with harmony with other viewpoints. So here we have the story, the famous story, that he puts the mechitza in, and that was, I guess, the straw that broke the camel's back. And the people were not happy with him, leading the people to be more religious, the young people. They fired him. However, I don't know what I'm supposed to say now. I have this book, Rabbi Meir Kahane's Life and Thought by Rabbi Kahane. This is his widow. This is 2008. This is a real book. She was a librarian. This is with footnotes and archival research. It's much more than just a wife writing about her husband. It's a history of the period. Him. So I want to read you something on page 42. We have people who might remember the era. You can explain this to me because I can't explain it. Obviously, she leaves certain things out. There's a certain element of Meir Kahane's life which you can't expect a wife to write about. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just look it up and you'll know what I'm referring to. It's when he was working undercover with the FBI, I guess, infiltrate the John Birch Society. But he says as follows. She says as follows. She mentions that this synagogue was a non-Orthodox synagogue. In fact, she says it was actually a member of the United Synagogue. But she says as follows. Meir accepted the rabbinical position at the Howard Beach Jewish Center with certain conditions. He demanded Orthodox practices, even though none of the synagogue members were observant, a kosher kitchen, traditional prayers, and separate seating for men and women with mechitza between them. Another condition was that the synagogue resign from the conservative movement's United Synagogues of America. Remarkably, the board of directors agreed to all of these terms. She says perhaps because the salary they're giving him was so much lower. So what's going on here? Rakefet has a whole story, and it's a famous story that when he wanted to put the mechitza in, that's what led to his being fired. And she claims that they agreed to put the mechitza in before they hired him. And in her version of the story, why is he fired? He's fired because he starts getting a whole following of young people. They start becoming Shomer Shabbos, and their parents didn't like that. They had to go to the beach on Shabbos and go places. And you have these kids saying, we got to stay home on Shabbos. So they fired him. So what's going on here? Did the Howard Beach Jewish Center have a mechitza when he became rabbi or not? You know, the Rakefet version of the story is actually more heroic because against the at nighttime, the story as he tells it, he has this Hasidim, and at nighttime they put it in the mechitza, and then on like Thursday night, so Friday the people come Friday night for services and they see a mechitza and they explode. Who are you, Rabbi? You don't decide what's going on there. So you have this version of the heroic Meir Kahane, willing to lose his position to put it in mechitza, but in Rabbi Kahane's version, there's no story here. They agreed to put it in. So I don't know what to make of it. And look, this is an art scroll. If it was art scroll, I'd say they're covering it up or something. They don't want you to know. But she doesn't cover it up. She says the story, and she would have said if it didn't have machitza, I think. I can't imagine she would make it up. I'm sure Rakefet would say that she has, let me see the source here, that she's playing fast with the truth here just to spare his reputation. She doesn't want people to think that he would actually take a position without a mechitza. But she has a source here after that paragraph from the Jewish Press from 1960 called End of the Miracle of Howard Beach. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe someone's going to listen who was a kid in Howard Beach at the time, and you could give us the answer to this, because it's not a hagiography. And okay, my friends. Now we turn to Nati Helfgott's book. And for those who just came on, you might not have heard that the rabbi mentions, Rabbi Kelman, that the Thursday night shir will be given Torah motion by Rabbi Nati Nathaniel Helfgott of Teaneck, and he published this volume. So Community Covenant Commitment, Selected Letters and Communications. So what we're going to do is, for a series of classes, I'm not going to do all the letters, no. I know a lot of them repeat each other, and there's 72 letters. No, that'll take us a few years. But we'll do a series of letters, and some are quite long. So I want to start with the first letter. And the first letter is really interesting. It's interesting to me because I was at Cornell in the fall or the winter, November. The letter is as follows. It's titled On Depiction of Human Images on Stained Glass Windows in Interfaith Chapel. The case was as follows. In 1950s, they decided, someone gave a lot of money. In 1949, actually, he donated $1.5 million. This man, Myron Taylor, chairman of the board of U.S. Steel, to his alma mater, Cornell, for the construction of an interfaith center that would bear the name of his wife, Annabelle. And at the time, there was a observant Jewish professor there named Milton Konvitz. Milton Konvitz, a labor economist. He's the son of Rabbi Joseph Konvitz, a big macher and agudas rabbanim, Rav of Newark, the son-in-law of I don't know how he made it, but Joseph Konvitz also was in Tzfat. He wasn't. He was the son-in-law of the Ridbaz, so I guess that's what brought him to Tzfat. Yaakov Dovolovsky, and he was his father was very close to the Rav. So when the question came up, Konvitz turned to the Rav. Now, they had this whole meeting about this interfaith chapel, and Konvitz assumed he wasn't arguing against the interfaith chapel. That in itself is of interest. He's arguing that if you're going to have an interfaith chapel and you want Jews to be welcome, you can't have images of people like in a shul. How can you have images of figures, Moses, especially you have Jesus or something, Muhammad, but even if it was just Old Testament figures, you can't have that. And he approached the president, and the president said, which itself is incredible, that if you get a leading rabbi, he mentioned Rav Soloveitchik, if he affirms that we can't have images, human images, we won't. Now, why in the 1950s would the president of Cornell University agree that the decision about the interfaith chapel depends on what Rabbi Soloveitchik says? Itself is quite significant. So Konvitz writes to the Rav, and Konvitz makes it clear that he's not asking about interfaith chapel. We're going to see the Rav has to deal with the interfaith chapel itself. As far as the Rav's concerned, the other point is like a side point, I think. The interfaith chapel is the main issue, but that's not what he's asking. So he has to also deal with that. And he says, Dr. Konvitz said to the Rav that his reply would only be read by the president and Mr. Taylor, the donor. The reason is that you have to then write this letter in a way that non-Jews could understand it. And Now, I want to show you, by the way, the pictures of what this chapel looks like, because it exists now. And the Rav's opinion was accepted about no human images. But just to get a sense of what it looks like, let me show you now. So what the Rav was dealing with. So here you have, well, first of all, it functions as an Episcopal church also. Here's a picture of, there's no images on the side, but here's what it looks like. So it's a very beautiful building, the Annabelle Taylor. Here you have a wedding, Jewish wedding. And you can see, so it looks like a church, but it's not well, I mean, it is a church, but it's not consecrated as a church. It's and you see on the side, there's, thanks to the Rav, there's no human images or anything. But can you use it? Can you have davening in this? Saturday davening, you can have church on Sunday. There's no cross there. And, if they want to put a cross in, it'll have to be a portable cross. So why can't the Jews use it on Shabbos? It's an interfaith chapel. And is this any different to just a room? If there's a room on campus, for instance, that we go and daven mincha, and then the Christians want to come in, or the Muslims, does it matter if it's just a space that we all use, or if it's officially turned into an interfaith chapel? So these are all questions that the Rav needs to deal with. So very interesting letter, precisely because he's writing to two non-Jews. And for years, I had heard about this letter. I tried to get hold of it. I never get a hold of it. And Natty was able to get a hold of it. I have to ask him who had it, because I asked people. I even think I asked Rackman, Louis Bernstein, I think. I asked a bunch of people, and no one had it. People had seen it, but they didn't have it. So call a kavod that he was able to get it. Look, actually, it might have been in Convitz's papers in Cornell. He has an archive there. In fact, Natty later would publish, well, I don't know, because Natty later found Convitz papers, in the Convitz papers, other letters of the Rav, which he published. I think it's in the Lookstein Jubilee volume. But however he got it, he got it. And the Rav, I would have thought he just would have very quickly dealt with this matter. He's not writing to Jews, Talmudic scholars, but he actually writes a whole essay, first dealing with why Jews don't have images. This is of interest. Those of you who are going to Tunisia with me, and it's not only Tunisia, other places, can you have an image of a Gadol Yisrael in a shul? There, I've seen at least one Lubavitch minyan that has a picture of the Rebbe. And we're going to see in Tunis that there's different Gedolim. And this is a question that was asked by one of the Rabbanim of Tunis. Can you have pictures of Gedolim in the synagogue and in the Beis Medrash, like on the sides? He actually rules that Rav Vadia says no, but the Rav of the Tunisian Rav says, as long as you're not facing them, like you're facing east, let's say, and on the southern wall or something, there's a picture of a Rav, you're allowed to. Although when I was in high school, I put up a huge poster in the classroom. We used to daven chakras in that classroom of Rav Yochanan Wasserman, and Rabbi Teitz came in. He saw it and he took it down. So I didn't know what's going on here. Why is Rabbi Teitz taking down a picture? It's the classic picture of Rabbi Yochanan. There's only like one real classic picture. So I went to Rabbi Teitz. Why'd you take down a picture of Rabbi Yochanan? It was a giant picture. It was for my brother's bar mitzvah. Every table was a Gadol Yisrael, and no, then you had that was the pictures like this big, and then you had giant poster-sized ones hanging from the ceiling, all the different Gedolim. That was the theme. It wasn't a baseball theme; it was a Gadol Yisrael theme. So you sat at your tables. You could be at Ramosha, the Ben Ish Chai. It was probably a unique. Those are the days when Rebbe cards were popular. So I went to Rabbi Teitz and I asked him, Rabbi Teitz Senior, Pinchas. It was like maybe the second time I ever spoke to him. The first time I spoke to him is I wanted to know why he wouldn't let us go. I spoke to him 3 times, basically. Once I asked him why we at JEC could not march in the Israeli Day Parade. Today they do march. I want to know why we couldn't march in the Israeli Day Parade. In those days, in the 80s, it was a big deal, Israeli Day Parade. It's not like today, but it was a big deal. And he said to me, Bazal Lashon, that's something for Talmud Torahs. We're a yeshiva. which I interpreted it to mean he didn't want maybe his friends in the Gudas Rabbanim to think that we're more not just a classical yeshiva, whatever. And then I asked him why, well, what does he have against marching for Soviet Jewry? Because he didn't let us do any Soviet Jewry stuff. And then he explained to detail his position, which I mean, I think it's wrong, but it was a well thought out position that he thought that the protests hurt the Jews of the Soviet Union, and that quiet diplomacy was the proper approach. I think history has shown that that was a mistake, that the Soviets very much did not want protests. They didn't like that, and that kept it in the news. When they went to the Rav about this, he sent them to some Soviet expert at Columbia University, and that expert said that the protests are good. That is, they would help the situation of the Jews, because then the Soviets would know that the West is paying attention to this. So then the third time I spoke to him was, why'd you take down my poster? And he said, you can't daven in a room that has a picture, even of a great man like Rabbi Kahane. You can't daven in a room with pictures. Okay, so the Rav, he deals with the fact that we seem to have passages in the Gemara that allow this, images of, he says that in Rosh Hashanah and Avodah Zarah, you find there's a statue of the king was displayed in the Babylonian synagogue. And yet we see that the Amoraim did daven there. The Rav very interestingly points out that in the course of time, tradition reversed its attitude. The Rav explains that although you could find sources in the Gemara to justify this, that the tradition moved away from this. He ties this into the fact that in a Christian environment in particular, images became associated with the man God of Christianity. And therefore, the fact that you could find sources that could support this, these have all been rejected. The only thing that is permitted is images like of animals, the lion, that sort of thing. Although there were, he says, synagogues that didn't tolerate panels with animals, the general minhag was more liberal, and that we do allow everything, images of animals, just not of people. I will add, however, since the Rav doesn't, that Rav Herzog says, yes, animals. And it's an old tradition to have images of lions. Although the Sephardim don't like this, they like to say that it's usher, but in our tradition, we definitely have lions, but not lions with wings or anything like that mythological, none of that. Then Rav explains why, despite Talmudic sources, that because of the role of icons in Christianity, we got rid of them. And he says as follows, to what our sages in non-Christian Babylonia did not object, our forefathers in Christian countries were very susceptible. And he says this isn't just a medieval addendum to the law. This expresses the point of the law. That is, in Babylonia, they didn't have a problem because everyone understood that the image, there's nothing religious about it. It just was an image. But in a Christian society, the image by definition assumes the role in people's mind that it could have. They have statues in Catholic churches. So by doing that, by having any such images, you're moving in a direction that leads us into an area that borders on what they're doing for religious reasons, so we can't do that. And he goes on and he explains, he even explains that an anthropomorphic symbol that will form part of the decoration of a stained glass window, which he says is going to be reminiscent of medieval Gothic cathedrals. What other great Torah scholar in Posei can tell you what a medieval Gothic cathedral looked like and bring it into his halachic argumentation? If this was a tshuva, he wouldn't. But remember, he's writing to non-Jews here. It is amazing. You have to look at it. You think that the president of Cornell and his donor are interested in knowing what appears on Masechet Shabbat and Rashi from Exodus and all this. It's amazing that the Rav assumes that they're going to be interested in this, that he's writing all this stuff to them. But he talks about the Christological motifs, and that if you're going to make a chapel with images, it'll bring people's mind that it'll look like church architecture, and it does, even without the images. Look what I just showed you before. It definitely looks like church architecture. So can you imagine if there was images in it? And then he says, therefore, my recommendation would be not to agree to any representation of the human form in spite of its universal character. Okay, he could have ended there. And this was accepted by the president of Cornell and by the donor to this day. But then he says, but I'm going to raise another question, another problem, even though you didn't ask me about it. And that's the whole idea of an interfaith chapel. And he says, quote, I strongly object to the use of an interfaith chapel. The halacha is unequivocally opposed to it, and this prohibition is even more strict than that concerning human images. I guess from Convence's perspective, they're putting up the interfaith chapel. That's going to happen. And Jews are going to use it. Non-religious Jews are going to use it. So, tafasta merubah tafasta. You got to take what you can get. And we don't want Jews in an interfaith chapel, even non-Orthodox Jews with images. So at least get rid of the images. But the Rav is he says, I cannot help but be frank and outspoken about this. I wonder if Convitz, when he handed the letter in, cut this part of the letter out, because we're going to offend the donor and say that we think that this is an abomination, interfaith chapel. This guy thinks he's doing a wonderful thing. And he goes on and talks about, quote, the idea of a common house of prayer is absolutely irreconcilable with the Judaic philosophy of worship. And he says this is not because of intolerance or narrow-mindedness or a feeling of superiority. He says that, once again, we identify with our Gentile neighbors when it comes to social, political, cultural activities. But when it comes to religion, we each have to, we're each individual, we're each special. That's where he says we have a personal, intimate, and tender relationship, which can't be shared with anyone else. And if it's in the same room, even at different times, you're sharing it. That's why he says the use of a common chapel is objectionable from the Jewish viewpoint and insists on the uniqueness and individuality of the form of service and the place in which we worship. He also says, he speaks about some of the problems that we have. The Christian church sees the act of worship as a sacramental, mysterious performance, which you have an organ, the stained glass windows. It's very different to our service, which is simplicity and is a dialogue between God and man, this worldliness, no magical, stuff going on with the priest. And he says, I'm unable to comprehend how you can have a chapel with two mutually exclusive ways of worship. Where Jews are this worldly, man and God, and Christianity is highfalutin with, an intermediary and the organ and the architecture. The whole arrangement of the church is designed to be, mysterious and take you into a different place. Very, very different than he says the whole organization of the service and the arrangement of surroundings, he says, serve one purpose, the intensification of a feeling of supernaturalness, strangeness, and meta-rationality. I've never heard this word, meta-rationality, but the Rav used it. And we're just the opposite, he says. We're this worldly, we're concrete. Our service is in the atmosphere of rationality, familiarity, and naturalness. And then he says, I'm convinced, he says, it's our privilege and duty as Jews and Americans to oppose the Christianization of the synagogue, either in its architecture or its mode of worship. And as it would be the privilege and duty of a good Christian to object to the Judaization of a church. He's saying that Christians, I don't know if he's saying this because he expects the people to read it, or if he really believes it, that just like Christians should reject Judaizing the church, so too we reject Christianizing the synagogue. The reason I say I wonder whether this is just for the non-Jewish readers is because I would think that if the Christians would Judaize the church, for example, get rid of the Trinity, wouldn't that be a positive thing? So is that something that the Rav would oppose? But and then he explains the last paragraph that if we have an interfaith chapel, this could lead to disastrous consequences. Students who spend 4 years at a university and get used to the fact that when they go for synagogue, where do they go? They go to an interfaith chapel that expresses more the spirit of the church than the synagogue. When they then are leaders in their communities, they're going to be inclined to introduce, as he calls, a church synagogue center. That is, they're going to then go to their synagogues and they're going to bring this this Christianization of the synagogue that they were with for 4 years, and they're going to bring it into the shul, that is the non-Orthodox shuls. And he ends the letter that he asks them to keep this letter confidential. So here we have, as I said, an important letter, a fascinating letter. I'll just mention that one more point about this that Gerald Blitzstein pointed out. Actually, no, I believe it. I already mentioned it, but I want to raise for you the question. Incidentally, I know of a shul in a school that has images of the moon and stars in the shul. It has like a whole art thing in front next to the Aron Kodesh. I don't see how that's permissible. Specifically, we're not supposed to have, unless you're going to say that it doesn't apply, unless you think that the moon and stars are divinities. But I think the pshat is you can't do that. Okay, so we saw the Rav's position. I don't know what the Rav would say on an ad hoc basis, though. Well, let me give you an example. Are you allowed to daven in a mosque? What's a mosque? A mosque is simply a room that non-Jews worship God in a kosher way. And none other than Ravad Yosef, Rabban Shel Yisrael, Paskins halacha l'maisa that you can daven in a mosque, and Jews do daven in a mosque. Maras Machpelah, the section for Yitzchak. I think one of the other sections also. It's not open that much anymore after Baruch Goldstein, but that's a mosque. It's a functioning mosque. People daven there. But you might say, when are you ever daven in a mosque? How realistic is that? Well, I'll tell you you might want to daven in a mosque. As far as I know, there's only 3 airports in the world, correct me if I'm wrong, that have a shul in them. Kennedy Airport, and that's not really in the, right, that's like a separate building as I recall. Ben Gurion, Frankfurt Airport, right smack in the middle of the airport has a shul. Okay, so you arrive at 7 a.m., wherever you arrive in Europe, and you want to daven and put your tefillin on, and maybe you feel a little strange putting it on, so you want to find a separate place. Well, can you go in the mosque and daven there? And Chacham Avadia says, absolutely, you can. It's just a room. That's all it is, where non-Jews worship God in a kosher fashion. In fact, I did some looking around online, and I even found a story of where this rabbi mentions that he davened in the mosque, and the Muslims came in, and he thought it was going to be a bit of a problem, and turns out no, they told him, finish up your prayers, and it was very nice. And the whole point of the story, you can find this if you Google it, I'm sure, is that his expectation was it would be a problem. It turned out to be very nice. Then I saw someone else, I think a Lubavitcher, who told a different story that he did daven in the mosque, and no one was around. See, the mosques are empty. I went to Heathrow and I went to the mosque to daven, but then I felt weird, so I davened outside. It's if you know where the mosque is, it's like it's amazing they don't give it a nicer place. It's like in the bowels of the airport. But this guy told the story that people came and he felt uncomfortable, like they were very annoyed with him. But I'm thinking, I don't know if that's anti-Semitism. If I came into the Frankfurt airport and there was a group of Muslims on the floor there with their prayer rugs davening there, I don't think I'd feel so good either. It's our shul. So I get it. But I don't know what the Rav would say about a case like this. It seems like the Rav would hold that absolutely it's not a question like Rav Avadia looks at it just as a monotheism or not. Is it a kosher place? The Rav sees he's way beyond that. He sees each religion as individual, connecting to God in their own ways. Muslims don't connect with God the way we do. So therefore, you can't share a prayer space unless the Rav would say we're speaking on a permanent basis or a semi-permanent basis, but not occasionally. Remember, if I'm at a place and it's time for us to daven mincha, and they tell us, well, 3 weeks ago this church group had their gospel service in this room. That doesn't mean we can't daven there. Just because they had their gospel service there doesn't mean we can't go there. It's a room for everyone. They use it, we used it. The problem is when you make it, a place, dafka for that, then it's, so I don't know what the Rav would say. Now, so a mosque is different. It's not just a room where you go. It's established for them. So I don't know what the Rav would say, though, as an ad hoc, a one-time thing. I can tell you that in United, by the United Airlines in Newark Airport, by the Terminal C, right when you make the right turn there to go down to all the international flights, they call it the interfaith or meditation room, whatever it is. It's supposed to be an interfaith chapel. I walked in there once, and I don't know if they always have this or just occasionally but there was all sorts of Christian paraphernalia on the walls. So maybe they just finished the service. I don't know if it's always there. You can imagine two types of approaches to the interfaith. One is that you have no images or anything, and then if you can bring in a portable thing if you do it. But you can imagine another thing that, well, you have images of all the ones. You have the cross, you have the Jewish star, you have everything. So I don't know what the Rav's position is. I found just today, accidentally, because I was looking for stuff about Tunisia, and then in Rav Nissim, the chief rabbi, he has a number of volumes of tshuvot, small tshuvot. They're called L'chal U'Ifrat. So I'm looking through it just to find stuff about Tunisia. The interesting questions he was asked there, because as Rabbi Kalman said, we'll be on the bus, and I got to talk about lots of things on the bus to keep him busy. So lo and behold, in volume 3, page 83 and on, there's a letter from a Rabbi Dr. Y. Rappaport, the rabbi of Sherit Israel in Melbourne, Australia, from 1966, about having at Monash University at Beit Tefillah Chol Hadatot, an interfaith chapel at this university. And can you have it? And can Jews contribute to it? Rav Nissim says you can't participate in it, that if the pressure is such, he thinks that you would be able to contribute, like to the university, make a donation to the university, and if the university wants to use the money for the chapel, that's their business. In other words, you can make the donation they come to you, they're saying, we're building a chapel, so you make the donation not to the chapel, to the university. If they want to use the money, they can. But then he says something which I don't know if the Rav would go this far. I'm not sure. It's problematic, I think, if you know how universities are structured today, because they're building this whole interfaith center. And in addition to an interfaith chapel, they're going to put, they're having offices. So you're going to have the rabbi's office in this big building, and you'll have the Catholic leader, the Protestant leader, whatever they're going to have. So the rabbi asks, he assumes that it's you can't daven in a interfaith chapel, even when the non-Jews are not using it. But then he asks the question, can the Jewish students daven in the rabbi's office? What could be the problem with that? And Rav Nissim says, if his office has a separate entrance, then the entrance that they use for the interfaith chapel, there's no Isser. Actually, I was going to say, I don't see how you can say that. But I think what he means here is that he says if you look, you're going to enter a main entrance, and then you're going to have a separate entrance into the chapel, and then a separate entrance then you go upstairs to the rabbi's office. Okay, that's what he's saying. That's not a problem. It would be a problem, he says, if you have to enter into he says if there's a knisa l'makam hamiyod tefillah that for everyone, he says, so if you'd enter this interfaith chapel and then maybe the rabbi's office was off the interfaith chapel, that would be a problem. But okay, so I take back what I said. So that's the letter. Now, the next letter we're going to get to next class, just briefly, I'll just tell you about directing foundlings to Jewish welfare agencies, but then the very long letter, the 40-page letter on rabbis in the chaplaincy, where the Rav sets forth a halachic approach at odds, I think, with what you see in halachic man. So we'll have to challenge ourselves a little bit. What's going on here? Is the Rav's halachic model his grandfather, the Ish Halacha, or is it what we see here? Or is there perhaps not a contradiction? A lot of people assume that there is a contradiction, and one is the reality and one is the theory. But this is one of my favorite letters from the Rav. I'll explain to you why next class. In the meantime, and we're only going to meet, let's see, we'll meet, next week. That's it. Just one more time, and then we'll break for the summer. So but it'll be good to break with the Rav because it's amazing. I was I was in Israel and two people stopped me on the street. People are watching the classes. I don't know these people, but they recognize me from the classes. So I'm happy to see that people are interested. So let me take the questions here. Marc says, "Can I elaborate on the comment of soccer on a flat surface?" Well, already the traditional posting discussed that the problem with ball playing is that you might make holes like in the ground and things. So the issue, if it's a flat surface, that's not going to be an issue. Now I don't know. I mean, when you walk, you could also make holes. I'm not sure.
I don't get that. Why the angle of the surface?
Well, you flatten it. Sorry, not you make holes. You flatten it. That's the surface. You flatten the surface by running and things like that. That's what they speak.
You're
about.
saying flat, then you don't mean horizontal. When you say flat, then I don't think you mean horizontal. You mean if there are no depressions in it or little hillocks.
I mean, everything. You're changing the surface levels and everything. That's what they speak about.
But you don't mean this versus this. You're meaning that the surface is even. You don't care about the angle. I got you, I think.
I think if there's holes, like you fill the holes in, all those things.
But that is nothing with being horizontal versus at an angle. When you said flat, you don't mean horizontal.
And you flatten it and things like that.
You don't mean, when you say flat, you don't mean horizontal. You mean even.
Even, exactly.
Okay,
even.
Now I got you.
Okay. In fact, I'll bring. I'll get the exact sources because there is disputes about this. I just threw that out there. I don't have all the facts here at my hand, but there's disputes over how far you take about this, and the whole issue of sports is of interest. Already in the Venetian ghetto, we have a tshuva. We have a tshuva from Mantua for Moshe Provenzali, who permits a game. They called it rackets, sort of like tennis. And Rav Leon Modna tells us that they would play tennis in the Venetian ghetto, a sort of tennis. But the flat surface is not really an issue, at least for Ashkenazim. It wouldn't be a problem. Rabbi Berman, if you look in the, someone reminds me that I think it's the first Edah journal, he has an article there that that technically is, yes, so there is a source that says the base of Midrash is destroyed because of that. But I mean, technically this is allowed. And that's what Rav Kook was saying, that if there's a difference between, taking a ball and just throwing a few hoops in your backyard and actually playing a game where you get sweaty or and certainly a tournament. That's how we have to understand what he's saying. Now, Cohen says changing the oven temp on the display is writing. I get, is it writing? You say because it's permanent. Is it permanent? Let's say it would go. So they could create it where it wasn't permanent. They've done all these things with the oven, GE and all their scientists. Couldn't you then make it where it comes on and goes off, so it's not permanent? Assuming we say that's permanent, the writing, I don't know. Does everyone agree that sort of LED display is actually writing? But if it is writing, so they can make it so it's not permanent. I would think. Look, there's no need to, I guess. But I'm not sure if it's not permanent writing, I don't know what the issur would be. Paul says, regarding kosher, non-kosher slaughter, some years back, there was a major scandal in London when a photo was published, a refrigerated truck delivering Kadassia, Shlita, Haredi beef carcasses to kosher butchers were clearly visible were pig carcasses hanging in the same truck. Kadassia claimed there's no issue involved. Well, I mean, it's hard to see that sounds crazy, but yeah, I mean, because the situation in America was that they at least they claimed that they were separate parts of the slaughterhouse. But Agudas Rabbanim, and everyone accepted this in America. But then there were problems where there was the claim was that there was mixture, and they couldn't prevent it. And as anyone who's ever worked in a hotel, knows that things get mixed. I worked in a very firm kosher hotel, and I don't know how it happened, but you see dairy silverware where the meat was. Things just happened. So Agudas Rabbanim made this decree, which was then affirmed and reaffirmed, that you can't have a kosher slaughterhouse. So the Star case said, well, wait a second. Every kosher slaughterhouse is non-kosher, because whatever not slaughtered, they find it's non-kosher. That's non-kosher. So they're all together. But Agudas Rabbanim know that also, and they said there's a difference. You have to immediately mark those as treif, and that's different than when you have a plant, which, not just a plant, even as I recall, the gezerah is you can't even own it if it's not even in the same place. You cannot own. I recall that's the text of the Takana, maybe not the first Takana, but the second, as I recall, that you cannot own a kosher and non-kosher slaughterhouse, even if they're not there together. And maybe Kadasi would say, Paul, that if it's pig, you're not going to get confused. If it was beef, fine, you can't tell the difference in kosher and non-kosher beef, but no one's going to tell that. No one's going to confuse pork with kosher. But it's mius. There's no question that it's. I can't imagine any from person eating meat that was together in a truck with a pork. Rabbi Hartman says, you asked Rabbi Felder with Shilos, he was very helpful, especially with Philadelphia, which had a strong kashrus organization and is very confusing with the Orthodox. Yeah, I know Philadelphia was, I don't know if they still are, but they were one of the few places where rabbis gave hashkacha on restaurants, the vegetarian type of restaurants. I'll tell you something I asked Rabbi Felder. He was a character. Let me tell you something. He spoke his mind. He told me that, because he was the posting for the Chaf K. So I asked him, I was talking to him about kitnios. This is after the Shabbos, because I called him also a few times. I said to him, according to the halacha, as is understood by most, not Rav Shechter, but as most, that kitnios is batul barov. That is, according to most, that means that if you're making a product, if a non-Jewish company is making a product and they have corn syrup in it, and it's 30% corn syrup, it's a kosher. And that's what I think is going on in Israel right now. Everyone's telling me that in Israel, Ashkenazim are eating kitnios. And what I say to them, and no one's telling me otherwise, is find me any Ashkenazim who are eating actual beans. It seems they're all eating products that have kitnios in them, which are either permissible if you hold that, like Rabbi Yitzchak Hanan, that liquid derivatives are kosher, or it's batul barov. So I mean, if you hold this, though, I spoke to Rav Shechter also. Rav Shechter thinks differently. He thinks that if it's part of the production process, we don't say batul barov. This goes back to an old dispute with the Rashba, but I think generally in your day they hold not like the Rashba. In any event, so I asked Rabbi Felder, because if that's the case, Coke, you don't need special kosher Pesach yellow top Coke because it's batul barov. Rabbi Felder told me that in his opinion, kitnios, that is batul barov, if people would ask him, can they have regular Coke or have these elite candies, he would tell them that it's permissible. So I said to him, so how come the Chaf K doesn't give hashkacha to these products? And he said, because the people won't accept it. That's what he told me. He said, the people won't accept it because it's Pesach. So that comes from, he's a real Talmid Chacham. So someone says they emailed me a clip about Meir Kahane and Howard Beach, so I'll get back to that next class when I get to it. Gedolim cards are very much in vogue again. I collected them before as in fashion, but I didn't save any of them. Maybe some of them will be collector's items. And I still remember Moshe Soloveitchik, that famous picture of Moshe Soloveitchik standing up with his a gray jacket, not a black jacket, with the Gemara in his hand. It's like one of the only two pictures we have of Moshe Soloveitchik. That was in the collection. And Marc says that Lubavitch Cherry felt strongly that Soviet Jewry demonstrations were harmful. Yes, he did. And Rabbi Teitz pointed it out. Rabbi Teitz got Agudas Rabbanim to go along with this also. When I was in JC, Yosef Mendelovich, those are of age. If you don't know who he is, look him up. He came to JC and he spoke. And he told all of us, students, he says, you need to go out and you need to protest, because when you were protesting in the streets, that's how we in the Soviet Union knew that we weren't forgotten. He said that. He became a very frum Jew later, not when he was in Russia, but actually in Russia, I think, as well. But I guess he's quasi-Haredian now or something. But he said that together, where Rabbi Teitz is sitting right next to him. So that was the second time I spoke to Rabbi Teitz. I went up to him and about Soviet Jewry. And Rabbi Teitz told me, he said, I told him afterwards that he's a Rodef. by telling him to do that. He's a rodef. So I I, I wrote a review. Rebbitzin Blau, Rivka Teitz Blau, wrote a wonderful book about her father. So she asked me to review it because maybe I'm the only Jewish historian to ever graduate from JSC. I don't know. So in the review of it, very nice book about early American Orthodoxy and his life in Europe. I say that until the archives are open, I don't think we can actually decide 100%. What was the proper approach? But I think the experts, I think the experts agree that the public pressure had an enormous impact and that the Soviets responded to that. Rabbi Yellen says, and Rabbi Yellen was a chaplain, most chapels on military installations were interfaith chapels that had no permanent religious symbols. And they were used at church on Saturday, church on Sunday, and shul on Shabbos. And your understanding was that many Gedolim had approved this. Now, again, Rabbi Yellen, we're going to talk next class when the Rav speaks about being in the military. That's a different circumstance. In the military, if you don't have a choice, that's what they give you. That's not a chachila. That's the reality. So I don't even know if the Rav would have opposed it in the military because you're dealing in a different situation there. That's different than setting up a place where you're going to have interfaith. And Rabbi Yellen points out Ramosha also believed that Soviet Jewry demonstrations weren't helpful. Indeed. And the Agudas Rabbanim came out against it. Rabbi Teitz convinced them all that this was, Rabbi Teitz said to me in that conversation, I still remember, he said that he made it seem like basically these people were idiots. He says, if the Soviets would respond to people protesting, then you know what's going to happen next? Then the Armenians are going to be out protesting and the Christians are going to be protesting. He says, everyone is oppressed there. He says, that's why they will never respond to public protest. Everything has to be done. And Rabbi Teitz went over 30 times to the Soviet Union, and he had all sorts of relationships with Soviet government officials. He printed Sidurim and Chumashim, and he had all sorts of connections there, and he did great things. But it's Tzvi Yehuda Kook told everyone to go out and protest. So it's a dismachokas of the Gedolim. But the Rav's position was, we don't need the Gedolim for this. You find out from the experts, whatever the experts in Soviet studies say, go with the experts. Just like on Yom Kippur, if you want to know you have to eat, you ask the expert, the doctor. If you want to know if you should protest, what does the rabbis know? Now, Rabbi Teitz wasn't just a rabbi. Rabbi Teitz was someone who, as I said, who had been involved since the 50s in the Soviet Jewry movement. And he just had a different approach. So you have to take it seriously. Doesn't the YU lobby have a zodiac embedded in the floor? It might, but are they davening there? And even if they are, what's wrong with a zodiac? In Dura Europa synagogue, they have a zodiac. Oh, you mean because you have the images there of the...
that's not might, it's there.
I don't know.
Zodiac is on the floor.
Not on the floor, but are they davening there?
No.
I don't know.
But there are shuls you find from ancient Roman Palestine.
Yes,
Schools
but understand, but the Gemara, this is before the Gemara, so they're grandfathered in.
Well after the Gemara.
Well, after the Pesach of the Gemara, okay. So the halacha, as we've decided, if you look at, I think the Rambam even says in the Mishnah, as I recall, that you can't have images of the heavenly bodies. I think he says that in Hillel
Shul and Beit Sha'an that has the zodiac, and a curious thing, Dali, the letters are written backwards.
It's Beit Alpha, actually, not Beit Sha'an.
Alpha, right, sorry.
Beit Alpha, yeah. Okay. Gershon says that the church opposite Darchei Noam in Englewood offered a chapel to the shul when it was being rebuilt. Would the Rav have objected? We know that people davened in, there was a case in England. Rabbi Deiches, I think, gave permission for this in Leeds. And Rabbi Shemarim Nasha Adler went crazy over this. I think it was Rabbi Deiches, that they were using a chapel. I think they had a separate entrance, not a chapel. They were using a room in a church, I believe, in Newton, Massachusetts. Shaarei Tefillah, if we have any Newton people here. I believe before the shul was built, if I'm not mistaken, they were using in a church, like a separate, like in a part of the building. I think Shaarei Tefillah, but would the Rav have objected? The Rav was... He was Christophobic, let's say. Yeah, he didn't like anything. He thought Christianity was very, very problematic for a variety of reasons. But I don't think you need to be the Rav to say that it's not appropriate to use a a room in a church to daven, even if it's a separate room. It's hard enough to have a heter. If you can find a heter to go vote in the church, you're not voting in the chapel, you're voting in a different room. But even if technically you're going to say that it's permissible, it's a mos, it's terrible. You can't, because it's not like a mosque. It's we think maybe for them it's okay, shituf, but for us it's avodah zarah. How can you walk into a building, which even though the actual base of avodah zarah is over here, but it's still a building that's devoted to avodah zarah? How can we have a shul in such a building? I don't see it. It makes no, to me, I don't think it's possible. Eli, MIT has had an interfaith chapel since '55. The Aron Kodesh is housed in the basement and is raised by elevator on Friday. Similar non-Jewish ritual objects are raised. Okay, very interesting. With cases like that, you have to ask yourself, though, was a shaila ever asked? Did a Rav ever give a psak in 1955? Were there any real Orthodox Jews who cared at MIT? Or even if they were Orthodox Jews, did they just do it?
Very few.
Very few. So again, and it might be interesting that, are you going to change it if it's already been done now for all these years? Sometimes these things, you wouldn't have done it. Like one of you emailed me a picture of what you think at least is a synagogue that looks like they bought it from a church, and it looks like a church. Didn't look like a church so much to me. So you're all upset that it's like, and you think they should change the architecture. Well, it's one thing to build from scratch, but if it's going to cost $1 million to change or $100,000 to change the facade, I don't know. Marty says, is there a problem with publishing a human picture in a sefer? Absolutely not. This was quite common in Italy. It was common in Morocco in the 20th century. Many Gedolim had their pictures published in a sefer. You say one of your uncles published a Haggadah with the pictures of Gedolim in the back. There's a sefer there's a famous image of all the Gedolim. You have the Rambam's picture, you have the Barbanel's picture, all the Gedolim. They know what they look like. But you can put it in there 100%. You say your father thought this is improper, but I don't know your uncle's name, Yaakov Rotter. There was a Rotter who published Sfarim. Maybe that's it, but we know that they used to do it. They might, let me take that back. Maybe for Ashkenazim, some rabbis say it's improper. But the fact is that you have many Sephardic rabbis who would do this, and they didn't think it was a problem at all. Eli, the airport in Seoul has an interfaith room. Oh, it has an arrow on the 4-point to Mecca. Okay, so that's not a shul, though, but there's a shul in the Brussels airport. Shkoyach, I didn't know that. Rabbi Shubnow, you were a chaplain in the Navy, also chief rabbi of Japan, right? You had chapels on ships and on bases that were interfaith. Yes, but okay, this is the military. If you're on a ship, that's not the same thing as what the Rav's speaking about. So I think it's a different situation there. Okay. LJ Hospital, Justin says, is a tiny shul, Rabbi Chaplin's office that has every religious activity take place, followed by mincha. Okay. Oh, wait a second. Cedar Sinai today has an interfaith chapel that that Rav Asher Weiss permitted use of. The Jews use it. It has a letter on it, signed by Rav Asher Weiss. It's hanging there. So, but the situation there was that they couldn't build a new one. That's where it is. That's the situation, and he permits it. So there are times it can be permitted. Where the Rav is, maybe you could say the Rav is more machmir, or here they were building it from scratch. I don't know. So Michael says, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. Is that a problem? I think what it's referring to, Yeshaya, is when all the nations of the world recognize the one true God, then my house, namely the Beis Hamikdash, or if you want to extrapolate, a shul will be a house. So we'll be very happy. All the non-Jews will come to our shul, all the Gerei Toshav, all the Noachites, they'll come to shul and they'll daven. What's the problem? But the fact is that their God is not our God, at least for the Christians and the Muslims. There you go, Rabbi Yellen. There's a shul at Cedar Sinai. I was machavim. Thank you very much. And it's you say that he cites the Igros Moshe, but I remember that Rav Asher Weiss gave a psak to the Cedar Sinai shul, and he's a very reliable Rav, Rabbi Jason Wiener, and.
The article is very interesting. I mentioned it there. I couldn't cut and paste the site. It didn't work. But yeah, he wrote an article. Is one permitted to daven in the chapel? and he quotes the Rav's Cornell letter. He talked to Rabbi Shapiro about it, and he also quotes Ugos Moshe, not favorably, and then he quotes a whole bunch of other sources that allowed it.
Yes, I'm going to have to look at that article again. And finally, the last two things. Hadassah tells us that the Moscow airport has a synagogue. I did not know about that either. So now we have a few synagogues. And finally, last thing, Jared, you say Chabad in Miami bought a Greek Orthodox church with a 70-foot dome. It's a... in Hungary, they had these gezeros that were made about that you couldn't do certain things if you wanted to be, quote, Orthodox. In Hungary, Orthodoxy wasn't just Shomer Torah mitzvahs. You had to belong to a certain club. You had to. They made all these takanos, like you couldn't have a wedding in a synagogue, and one of them is you couldn't have a steeple. And lo and behold, the shul in Pressburg, they were building it, and they built it with the steeple. And when the Kasav Sofer found out about it, it was after the fact, and it would have been too complicated. So at B'diavad, he thought it was okay, but Rav Hillel Lichtenstein went crazy that, in this Ir V'Ein B'Yisrael, you're going to have something that looks like a Christian imagery, looks a little Christian. Okay, thank Rabbi Kelman.
Okay, I mean, Hillel Lichtenstein was a real Kanai from the Kanaim.
Oh, yeah.
Kanaim.
He even when his son-in-law was a Kiv Yosef Schlesinger, he thought that maybe he would have to put his son-in-law on Cherem.
Yeah, no, they're big Kanaim, but that was the well, okay. That's a whole other chapter. You can read Yaakov Katz's books about that. They think he
let me just ask a question for Rabbi Yellen. What is Nitzachon, Volume 5? I never heard of Nitzachon, where I can get Rabbi Wiener's article. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
I think it's in his book. Oh.
Yeah, I think he actually put it in his book too.
Correct. It's in his book. I'm 98% sure it's in his recent book. And I think I read the article
about medicine hospitals. Okay. Yeah, my university has that book, I think. So I will check that out. Yeah. Okay, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next week. And please God, this week, tomorrow, Rabbi Schulman continues his series. We continue through the summer, finishing up Sefer Daniel. Rabbi Helfgott's class will not take place this Wednesday night, his son's graduation, but he will be giving the Parsha Shir on Thursday night, as we mentioned before. Okay, I look forward to learning with you and inviting friends. We have a few more classes coming up soon. We haven't announced them yet, just to let you know for the summer. But the ongoing classes are continuing, and we look forward to seeing with you and learning with you. And everybody have a wonderful week, a wonderful night. And thank you very much. And invite your friends to join us. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov ותודה.